In a shocking development reported by a leading British news agency, Israel has launched an attack on the Global Samoud Flotilla, a humanitarian aid convoy heading towards Gaza. The incident has immediately triggered a storm of international condemnation, reopening debates about Israel's blockade of Gaza, the humanitarian crisis in the Palestinian enclave, and the fragile balance of global diplomacy in the Middle East. The incident at sea. According to initial reports, the Global Samoud Flotilla, a coalition of vessels carrying international activists, medical supplies, food, and essential humanitarian aid, was en route to Gaza when Israeli naval forces intercepted it in international waters. Witnesses reported that the Israeli Navy fired warning shots before boarding the ships. Within minutes, the situation escalated into violence, with tear gas, rubber bullets, and in some cases live ammunition allegedly used. Several activists were reportedly injured, and dozens were detained by Israeli security forces. The Israeli government quickly defended its actions, stating that the flotilla violated its blockade of Gaza, which has been in place since 2007 following Hamas' takeover of the territory. Officials argued that the flotilla posed security threats and claimed that humanitarian aid should instead be delivered through approved channels coordinated with Israel. However, flotilla organizers rejected these claims, calling the attack a brutal assault on unarmed civilians carrying food and medicine. They insisted their mission was purely humanitarian, aimed at breaking what they described as Israel's illegal siege on Gaza and drawing attention to the suffering of the Palestinian population. International reaction. News of the attack spread rapidly, prompting swift international responses. The United Nations expressed deep concern over the incident, with the Secretary-General calling for a transparent and impartial investigation. Several European governments, including those of Spain, Norway, and Ireland, condemned the assault and demanded the immediate release of the detained activists. Turkey, which has historically supported flotilla efforts to challenge the Gaza blockade, strongly denounced Israel's actions, describing the attack as piracy in international waters. Iranian officials also condemned the move, calling it a crime against humanity, while Arab League representatives convened an emergency session to discuss possible diplomatic and economic responses. The United States, Israel's key ally, took a more cautious approach, calling for restraint on all sides while reiterating Israel's right to security. Critics argue that Washington's muted response highlights the double standards in international politics, where strategic alliances often overshadow humanitarian concerns. Historical parallels. This latest incident immediately drew comparisons to the infamous Mavi Marmara raid in 2010, when Israeli commandos attacked a Turkish-led flotilla heading for Gaza, resulting in the deaths of 9 activists and sparking a major diplomatic crisis. The echoes of that tragedy are now reverberating once again, with critics accusing Israel of repeating history by targeting international humanitarian missions. Flotilla organizers noted that their coalition was multinational, including activists from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. "We are doctors, teachers, journalists, and human rights defenders," one activist said before boarding the vessel in Istanbul. "We are not armed. Our only weapon is solidarity." Gaza's dire situation. The context behind the flotilla's mission cannot be ignored. Gaza, home to over 2 million Palestinians, has been under an Israeli-Egyptian blockade for nearly 17 years. The blockade restricts the flow of goods, food, medicine, fuel, and building materials into the territory, creating severe shortages and crippling the local economy. International organizations, including the United Nations, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch, have long described the situation in Gaza as a humanitarian catastrophe. Hospitals often lack essential medicines and equipment, unemployment rates are among the highest in the world, and clean drinking water remains scarce for much of the population. The flotilla's mission, according to its organizers, was to highlight this crisis and provide direct relief, while symbolically challenging the legality of the blockade itself. Israel's justification and security narrative. Israel argues that the blockade is necessary to prevent weapons and military equipment from reaching Hamas, the ruling authority in Gaza, which Israel considers a terrorist organization. Over the years, Hamas and Israel have engaged in multiple wars, with thousands of casualties on both sides, most of them Palestinian civilians. Israeli officials reiterated that while humanitarian aid is welcome, it must be inspected and delivered through proper channels to ensure that no arms or dual-use materials reach militant groups. They claim that flotillas are often politically motivated and deliberately provocative, aiming to undermine Israel's sovereignty and security. Global repercussions. The attack on the Global Samoud Flotilla risks straining Israel's already tense relations with parts of the international community. Human rights groups across the world have announced protests, while social media campaigns demanding accountability are gaining momentum. Analysts warn that this latest development could fuel further unrest in the Middle East, where tensions are already high due to ongoing conflicts in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. The possibility of wider regional escalation cannot be ruled out, particularly as Iran and Turkey leverage the incident to criticize Israel on the global stage. Diplomatic fallout may also emerge at the United Nations Security Council, where member states such as Russia and China could push for resolutions condemning Israel. Actions. However, given the United States' history of vetoing such measures, the outcome remains uncertain. Voices of the activists. Survivors of the flotilla raid have begun sharing their testimonies. A British activist described the attack as terrifying, claiming that Israeli forces stormed the ship at dawn, firing rubber bullets and using tasers against unarmed passengers. Another activist from South Africa stated, "We carried food, medicine, and hope." Israel answered with violence. Families of detained activists are urging their governments to act swiftly for their release. Lawyers representing the Flotilla Coalition have announced plans to pursue legal action against Israel in international courts. The Palestinian perspective. Palestinian leaders in Gaza and the West Bank condemned the attack, praising the flotilla activists as heroes of humanity. Hamas officials called the raid evidence of Israel's fear of truth and solidarity, while the Palestinian Authority urged the international community to take concrete steps to end the blockade. Ordinary Palestinians in Gaza expressed gratitude toward the flotilla participants. "We are suffering every day, and the world ignores us," said a Gaza resident interviewed by phone. "These people risked their lives for us, and Israel attacked them as if compassion were a crime." Conclusion. The attack on the Global Samoud Flotilla underscores the deep divides in the global debate over Israel's blockade of Gaza. For supporters, the flotilla represents a lifeline of solidarity and humanitarian relief. For Israel, it represents a threat to national security and sovereignty. As the dust settles, questions loom: will the international community hold Israel accountable? Will Gaza's suffering finally be addressed? Or will this incident, like the tragedies before it, fade into the cycle of outrage and inaction that has long defined the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? For now, the world watches closely as activists sit in detention, Gaza remains under blockade, and the possibility of renewed regional confrontation grows ever more real.